My name is Brandon Cole, I'm 34 years old, and for almost 7 months my wife, Megan Harper, who is 31, wouldn't touch me. At first I told myself it was normal. We live in Cedar Park, just outside Austin, and she works long hours at a marketing firm downtown. She would come home exhausted, drop her purse on the kitchen counter, kick off her heels, and say she had back-to-back meetings all day. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Marriage isn't always fireworks and late nights, I kept reminding myself. Sometimes it's just routine. But the routine turned into distance. She stopped kissing me goodbye in the mornings. When I reached for her at night, she would shift away in bed and mumble that she had a migraine. Then it became Pilates classes across town, 3, sometimes 4 times a week, always at night, always with her phone on silent. The woman who used to fall asleep on my chest started going to bed after I was already asleep. Intimacy didn't just fade, it evaporated. We went from newlyweds who couldn't keep our hands off each other to 2 people sharing a mortgage and barely making eye contact after 9 p.m. I tried to talk to her about it once, gently, while we were washing dishes. I told her I missed her. She stiffened, told me I was being dramatic, that not everything was about sex. After that, I stopped bringing it up. Rejection does something to you. It makes you quiet. Then last Thursday, everything shifted so suddenly it made my head spin. I came home from work and the house smelled like vanilla candles. The living room lights were dimmed, soft music playing from the speaker we hadn't used in months. Megan was sitting on the couch in one of her loose sweaters, hands folded neatly in her lap like she had been rehearsing something. She asked me to sit down. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. She took my hands in hers, and for the first time in half a year, she didn't pull away from my touch. Her palms were warm, but slightly clammy. She looked at me and said, "I think we should have a baby." Just like that. No build-up. No discussion about fixing us first. No acknowledgement of the distance that had been choking our marriage for months. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like I had missed a step in the dark. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel surprise. I felt alarm. For 7 months she had avoided even brushing against me in the hallway, and now she wanted to create a life together. It didn't make sense. I studied her face as she smiled at me. It was the same smile she used at office parties, polite and carefully measured. It didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were scanning me, waiting for a reaction, almost calculating. And then I noticed her hand. At some point while she was talking about how we weren't getting any younger and how she had been thinking a lot about our future, her right hand drifted down to her lower stomach. Not casually. Not absent-mindedly. It rested there with a kind of unconscious protectiveness, fingers spread lightly as if shielding something delicate. She wasn't even aware she was doing it. That single gesture hit me harder than her words. My mind started replaying the last 7 months in brutal clarity, the late nights, the cold shoulders, the sudden privacy with her phone, the way she flinched when I tried to kiss her. 7 months of distance. Long enough for a secret to grow. She kept talking, her voice soft, almost hopeful, asking me what I thought about starting a family, about trying soon. But all I could see was that hand on her stomach, that guarded smile, the rehearsed calm. In that moment, I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones. She wasn't asking to try for a baby. She was already pregnant. Once that suspicion took root in my mind, it refused to leave, and everything from the past few months began rearranging itself in my head like one of those crime boards you see in documentaries, where random photos and dates suddenly connect with red string and form a clear, ugly picture. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unknow it. Every small moment I had brushed off as stress or coincidence now felt deliberate. The sudden diet change was the first piece that snapped into place. At her sister's engagement party back in the spring, Megan, who had always loved a glass of red wine, especially when she was dressed up and surrounded by family, declined champagne during the toast and said she was just not feeling alcohol lately. I remember teasing her about finally growing up, and she had laughed a little too quickly. After that, I noticed she stopped keeping wine in the fridge altogether. Bottles that used to disappear over a weekend just sat untouched until I eventually poured them down the sink. Then there was the coffee. For years she had been loyal to her triple shot lattes every single morning, the kind that made her jittery and talk too fast. Suddenly she switched to decaf. She told me her anxiety had been bad and caffeine was making it worse. I accepted that explanation without question. Now it felt less like anxiety and more like precaution. She also turned down our favorite sushi spot downtown, the place we used to go at least twice a month. The last time I suggested it, she wrinkled her nose and said raw fish sounded disgusting. I remember thinking it was strange because spicy tuna was practically her personality trait at one point. She insisted on ordering fully cooked food whenever we ate out after that, and I never connected the dots. And then there were the late evenings, the so-called client meetings and networking events in Austin. She said her firm was pushing hard for new contracts and that she needed to be visible, present, ambitious. I wanted to be supportive. I told her I was proud of her. Meanwhile, she was coming home later and later, sometimes after 10, sometimes close to midnight, always smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't quite the one she usually wore, like it had faded and mixed with something unfamiliar. One night stands out more clearly than the rest. She texted me around 7 saying she'd be working late at the office on West 5th Street and not to wait up. Something in me that night felt restless, maybe lonely, maybe desperate, so I decided to drive by with takeout from her favorite Thai place as a small surprise. I imagined her smiling, maybe softening, maybe remembering that we were still a team. When I pulled up to her office building, the entire place was dark. Not just her floor. The whole building. The parking lot was nearly empty, and her car wasn't there. I sat there for a full minute staring at the blank windows, telling myself she must have parked somewhere else, that maybe she had stepped out with coworkers. I didn't call her. I didn't confront her. I drove home, placed the untouched takeout on the kitchen counter, and pretended I hadn't seen anything. A few days later, fate handed me something I couldn't rationalize away. Megan came home from one of her evening classes and set her purse on the kitchen island before heading upstairs to shower. I was standing nearby when it tipped over and spilled its contents onto the marble countertop. Lipstick, her wallet, keys, and a folded piece of paper slid out. I picked it up automatically, intending to put everything back. The paper was thicker than a receipt, neatly folded in thirds. When I opened it, my eyes landed immediately on the heading, Women's Health Center, Obstetrics Department. Beneath it was an appointment date from 3 weeks earlier, along with a follow-up scheduled for the next month. My hands felt numb as I read it again to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting anything. Obstetrics. Not general care. Not routine checkup. Obstetrics. She hadn't just been pregnant. She had already started prenatal care. She had sat in a clinic, spoken to a doctor, possibly seen an ultrasound screen, all while coming home to me and flinching at my touch. And she had done it without telling her husband. I didn't confront her. Every instinct in my body wanted to storm upstairs that night, hold that appointment slip in her face, and demand the truth, but something colder and more controlled took over instead. If I was right, if she was already building a life that didn't include me, then reacting emotionally would only give her time to adjust her story. I needed facts, not a confession shaped by panic. So I texted the one person I still trusted without hesitation, my best friend, Tyler Brooks. We had met freshman year at college in Dallas, two broke 18-year-olds who bonded over terrible dorm food and worse decisions. Over the years he had become more like a brother than a friend. Now he worked as a surgical nurse at St. Matthew's Medical Center in Austin, pulling long shifts but somehow always staying steady, grounded, the kind of guy who didn't exaggerate or gossip. I kept the message simple and neutral, asking if he was free to grab coffee that Saturday morning. He replied almost immediately, saying he was post-shift but could meet for an hour before heading home to sleep. We met at a small cafe off Lakeline Boulevard, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and too many succulents on the windowsill. It was busy but not loud enough to drown out conversation. At first, I kept everything casual. I asked him about work, about the endless staffing shortages he had complained about for months, about the chaos in the ER. He talked about double shifts, difficult patients, and hospital politics while I nodded, barely processing a word. My mind was circling one question, and I was trying to find a way to ask it without sounding unhinged. Finally, when there was a natural pause, I took a sip of coffee to steady my hands and said as evenly as I could, "Hey, random question. Have you run into Megan at the hospital recently? She mentioned she had some checkups." The second the words left my mouth, I watched his face carefully. Tyler had always been bad at hiding reactions. There was a split second where his expression froze, just barely, like a glitch in a video. It was subtle, but I saw it. Then he looked down at his cup before answering. "Yeah. I saw her," he said slowly, choosing each word like it mattered. "She wasn't alone." My heartbeat started pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing in my skull. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral, to not betray how much that single sentence confirmed. "Not alone how?" I asked, keeping my tone light, almost curious. He hesitated again, and that hesitation was louder than anything he could have said. Tyler wasn't dramatic. If he was pausing, it was because he was weighing loyalty against truth. She was with one of the doctors, he finally said. Cardiology department. Name tag said Dr. Ethan Caldwell. The name meant nothing to me, but the way Tyler said it made my stomach twist. He explained that he had been passing through the corridor near one of the consultation rooms when he saw them. They weren't in a formal exam setting. They were standing close, too close, talking in low voices. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, Tyler added quickly, almost defensively. But I heard enough to know it wasn't professional. I stared at him, not blinking. They were talking about a timeline, he continued. I heard her say, our baby, and something about telling him soon. I didn't catch everything, but it didn't sound like a patient talking to a doctor. It sounded personal. For a moment, the cafe noise faded into a dull hum. Our baby. Telling him soon. The words lined up perfectly with the candles in the living room, the rehearsed smile, the sudden suggestion that we start trying. I didn't yell. I didn't slam my fist on the table. I didn't demand more details. I just sat there, absorbing it, letting the reality settle into something solid and undeniable. The suspicion that had been gnawing at me for days finally had shape and weight. Tyler looked at me carefully, probably waiting for some kind of reaction, maybe even bracing for one. Instead, I nodded once and said quietly, thanks for telling me. And I meant it. Because now I wasn't operating on instinct or paranoia. I had confirmation. A name. A department. Words that couldn't be twisted into innocent explanations. As I walked back to my car after we said goodbye, the February air felt sharper than usual, almost metallic in my lungs. My marriage wasn't unraveling in a vague, uncertain way anymore. It had a structure. It had players. It had a hidden timeline that didn't include me. And somewhere between the parking lot and my driveway, a plan began forming, not fueled by rage, but by clarity. That night Megan was in the kitchen when I got home, standing by the stove with the kettle steaming, humming softly to herself while slicing fresh ginger like she didn't have a single secret in the world. There was a glow about her that I hadn't seen in months, a kind of private happiness that made everything inside me feel hollow. I walked up behind her and kissed her cheek gently, the way I used to before all of this distance began, and I said in the calmest, warmest voice I could manage that we should celebrate because a baby was huge and we shouldn't keep something like that to ourselves. She turned toward me with wide eyes that sparkled in a way they hadn't in a long time, and for a second I saw pure relief flash across her face before she covered it with excitement. She really thought I had bought it, that I had swallowed the story she was preparing to feed me, that I was so desperate to fix our marriage I would accept anything that kept me in it. She stepped closer, wrapping her arms loosely around my waist, and said she had been hoping I would react exactly like that, that she had been so nervous to bring it up. I told her we should make it special, that we should gather the people closest to us and share the news properly instead of letting it trickle out in random phone calls, and I suggested a small celebration at the house that Saturday evening. I kept my tone enthusiastic, almost proud, saying we could invite our families, a few close friends, and some of her coworkers since they had apparently been such a big support system for her lately. She nodded eagerly, already talking about decorations and food, about how meaningful it would be to have everyone under one roof. Then, as casually as I could possibly manage, I added that she should invite Ethan too, mentioning that if he had been so supportive through all of this, it would only be fair to include him in the celebration. I watched her carefully when I said his name. There was a flicker in her expression, barely there, a split second where her smile tightened before she smoothed it over and agreed a little too quickly, telling me of course she would invite him, that he had been helpful and kind. That was the moment it fully settled in my chest like a stone. She truly believed I was stupid enough to raise another man's child and applaud the man who helped create it. She believed she could choreograph this entire lie and I would play my part without question. While she continued talking about guest lists and appetizers, I pulled out my phone under the table and texted Tyler, telling him I needed him at my house Saturday at 7 no matter what. He responded almost immediately that he would be there. I could picture the concern on his face even through the short reply. There was one more piece I needed in place, something Megan would never anticipate. After she went upstairs to shower, I sat alone in the living room with my laptop and searched for Ethan Caldwell. It didn't take long to find him, polished headshot and all, listed under the cardiology department. From there, it took even less time to find his social media profile and, eventually, his wife. Claire Caldwell. Family photos. Smiling children. Anniversary posts about gratitude and partnership. My hands were steady when I opened a message window and typed exactly one sentence: "If you want the truth about your husband, come to my house Saturday at 7 p.m. I included my address and nothing else. No explanation. No emotion. Just an invitation to reality. I hit send and closed the laptop. Upstairs, Megan was still humming, the sound drifting faintly down the hallway like everything in our house was perfectly normal. I leaned back on the couch and stared at the ceiling, knowing that by Saturday night, the illusion she had built so carefully was going to collapse in front of everyone she thought she controlled. By 7 that night the house was full in a way it hadn't been since our wedding afterparty, voices overlapping, glasses clinking, the smell of catered food mixing with the faint sweetness of the candles Megan insisted on lighting again. My parents had driven in from San Antonio that afternoon, my mother hugging Megan tightly at the door and already talking about nursery colors, while her parents had flown in from Phoenix and arrived with gifts that felt premature but symbolic, small wrapped boxes that sat on the dining table like props in a play none of them realized they were part of. Friends filled the living room, coworkers gathered near the kitchen island, neighbors hovered by the patio doors pretending not to eavesdrop. I moved through the crowd like a host on autopilot, shaking hands, accepting congratulations that hadn't even been officially announced yet because Megan had clearly hinted enough in her invitations to make the purpose obvious. Every smile I gave felt rehearsed, every thank you tasted metallic in my mouth. Megan looked radiant, wearing a soft blue dress that draped loosely over her stomach, her hand resting there again and again as if reminding herself of the role she was playing. Then Ethan arrived. He walked in with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged there, dressed in a tailored navy blazer that fit him too well, his posture relaxed, his expression composed. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look cautious. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. When our eyes met across the room, he gave me a polite nod before making his way over. He extended his hand and introduced himself like we were strangers meeting at a networking event, his grip firm, his smile measured. I shook his hand and held his gaze just a second longer than necessary, searching for any sign of guilt or hesitation. There was none. If anything, there was something almost smug in the steadiness of his expression, like he was confident in the story Megan had constructed. Throughout the evening I watched carefully without making it obvious. Megan drifted through the crowd, laughing, accepting hugs, thanking people for coming, but she kept orbiting back toward Ethan. When she thought I wasn't looking, she brushed her fingers lightly against his arm as she passed. Their shoulders touched near the kitchen counter and neither of them pulled away quickly. They shared glances that lasted a fraction too long, silent exchanges layered with meaning no one else in the room seemed to catch. My father was telling a loud story near the fireplace, her mother was already discussing baby names with one of Megan's friends, and the entire room felt suspended in anticipation, waiting for me to make some formal announcement. I let it stretch. I let the tension build quietly under the surface while the music played and people refilled their drinks. Then the front door opened again. Claire walked in. She didn't hesitate in the doorway, but she didn't rush either. She stepped inside slowly, scanning the room with sharp, controlled focus. She was dressed simply, dark blouse, jeans, no exaggerated effort, and her face was calm in a way that felt deliberate. She didn't greet Ethan. She didn't smile at him. She positioned herself near the back of the living room, close enough to see everything clearly, far enough to observe without interruption. I saw Megan notice her almost immediately. For half a second, just a flash, panic flickered across her face. Her hand dropped from her stomach. Her eyes widened before she forced a smile and turned away as if she hadn't seen anything unusual. Ethan followed her line of sight a moment later, and the color drained subtly from his face even though he tried to maintain composure. The room continued buzzing, unaware of the shift that had just taken place, unaware that the carefully balanced illusion was seconds away from cracking. I felt an unexpected calm settle over me, not rage, not chaos, just clarity. Every person who needed to be present was standing under my roof. That was my cue. I waited until the conversations reached a comfortable peak and then gently tapped my glass with a fork, the sharp, clear sound cutting through the room in a way that made everyone instinctively turn toward me. The music was lowered, voices faded, and within seconds the living room that had been buzzing with celebration fell into expectant silence. Megan stood a few feet away from me, one hand resting on her stomach again, her smile bright and proud as if she believed this was the moment she had been preparing for. I cleared my throat and began speaking slowly, deliberately, thanking everyone for coming, acknowledging the long drives from San Antonio and the flights from Phoenix, mentioning how much it meant to us to have family and friends gathered in our home. I spoke about trust, about how marriage is supposed to be built on honesty even when things are hard, about how becoming parents is one of the biggest commitments two people can make together. My voice sounded steady, almost warm, and I could see my mother dabbing at the corner of her eye already. I said I was excited to become a father, that stepping into that role required faith in your partner, and that faith required transparency. The words hung there for a second longer than comfortable, and I let the pause stretch before turning my head slightly toward Tyler, who was standing near the edge of the crowd with a glass he hadn't touched all evening. "Hey, man," I said calmly, holding his gaze. "Tell everyone what you told me last week. About the hospital." The shift in the air was immediate and almost physical, like the oxygen had thinned. Megan's posture went rigid, her hand slipping from her stomach as her eyes snapped toward me in disbelief. Ethan, who had been standing near the kitchen island with a drink in his hand, stiffened so abruptly that the ice in his glass clinked loudly in the silence. Tyler swallowed hard. I could see the conflict on his face, the weight of speaking up in front of dozens of people, but he straightened his shoulders and stepped forward slightly. He explained that he worked at St. Matthew's Medical Center and that a few weeks earlier he had seen Megan there. He clarified that it wasn't a routine visit in a general department but on the obstetrics floor. He described passing by and overhearing enough of a conversation to know it wasn't strictly professional, that he distinctly heard the phrase "our baby" and a discussion about a timeline and telling him soon. Gasps rippled through the room in uneven waves. My father muttered something under his breath. Megan's mother looked like she had stopped breathing entirely. The room that had been decorated for celebration now felt like a courtroom. I shifted my eyes back to Megan and held them there. "You weren't planning on telling me the baby isn't mine, were you?" I asked, not shouting, not trembling, just stating it plainly. Her reaction was immediate. Tears flooded her eyes as if they had been waiting for a cue. She covered her mouth with her hand and shook her head. "It's not what it sounds like," she cried, her voice cracking in a way that might have sounded convincing if the evidence hadn't already been laid out. It was such a predictable line that it almost felt scripted, the exact phrase people reach for when there is no clean explanation left. Around us, people shifted uncomfortably, some looking at the floor, others staring openly at Ethan, whose face had gone pale despite his effort to remain composed. And then Claire stepped forward. She moved from the back of the room with a calm that was more cutting than anger, her eyes fixed on her husband. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Megan. She looked directly at Ethan, and in that moment the silence deepened even further, as if everyone understood that whatever came next would finish what I had started. Claire didn't hesitate. She walked straight across the living room, weaving through stunned guests who instinctively stepped aside, her posture rigid and her expression carved from something far colder than anger. Ethan opened his mouth as if to say her name, but he never got the chance. The sound of her hand connecting with his face cracked through the silence so sharply that it felt like glass breaking. The entire room froze. No music. No whispers. Just the echo of that slap and the faint sound of someone's glass being set down too hard on the counter. Ethan staggered half a step to the side, his hand flying to his cheek, the red imprint already forming against his skin. He looked less like a confident doctor now and more like a man who had just realized the walls had closed in. Claire didn't raise her voice, but the control in it made every word land heavier. "You thought I wouldn't find out?" she said, staring directly at him, her eyes steady and unblinking. He tried to respond, but whatever excuse he had prepared dissolved under her gaze. His mouth opened and closed without producing anything coherent. The man who had stood in my house earlier like he belonged there now looked small, cornered. Claire then turned her attention to Megan. The shift in her focus was deliberate, slow, and when her eyes landed on my wife, Megan visibly recoiled. The tears were still streaming down her face, but now they looked less strategic and more panicked. "You really plan to pass his child off as your husband's?" Claire asked, her voice sharp but controlled, cutting through the thick tension that had settled over the room. Megan tried to speak. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She shook her head weakly, as if denying the accusation without offering an alternative explanation. The confidence she had worn all evening had completely evaporated, replaced by a trembling uncertainty that made her look like a stranger to me. Claire didn't wait for an answer. She reached into her purse with deliberate calm and pulled out a thick manila envelope. The sound of the paper shifting inside it seemed impossibly loud in the silence. She stepped closer to Ethan and shoved the envelope into his hands with enough force that he almost dropped it. "Divorce papers," she said flatly. "Filed 2 days ago." A murmur spread through the crowd, low and stunned. I felt my parents' eyes on me, felt the weight of dozens of people absorbing the reality unfolding in my living room. Claire continued speaking, not raising her voice, not losing composure. "I already suspected something," she said, her gaze flicking briefly toward me before returning to Ethan. "The late nights. The secretive phone calls. The sudden interest in extra shifts that didn't exist. Your message just confirmed it." Her words landed with finality. She had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough to prepare. Enough to act. My message hadn't blindsided her, it had validated what she had already pieced together on her own. Ethan looked down at the envelope in his hands as if it weighed 100 pounds. The confident posture, the polished smile, the ease he had carried into my house were gone. In their place was a man exposed completely, not in a quiet office or behind closed doors, but in front of colleagues, friends, and family. Megan stood a few feet away, crying openly now, her shoulders shaking, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for someone to rescue her from the consequences of her own choices. No one moved toward her. No one spoke in her defense. In the span of a few minutes, everything they had tried to keep hidden was dragged into the open. Not privately. Not quietly. But in front of everyone they claimed to care about. While Megan stood there sobbing, her mascara streaking down her face and her hands trembling uselessly at her sides, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. The chaos in the room no longer felt overwhelming, it felt distant, like I was observing the aftermath of something that had already ended long before tonight. I walked slowly to the coffee table near the center of the living room where we had once placed wedding albums and holiday decorations, and I picked up the envelope I had prepared earlier that day. It was thinner than the one Claire had handed Ethan, but it carried just as much weight. I placed it down deliberately on the table in front of Megan, the sound soft but final. "Those are yours," I said evenly. "Divorce papers. Filed yesterday." Her crying faltered instantly. She looked at the envelope as if it might disappear if she didn't focus on it directly. The color drained from her face so quickly it was almost alarming, her lips parting slightly as she processed what I had just said. For a moment she looked less like someone caught in a lie and more like someone who had miscalculated a move in a game she thought she controlled. 3 years ago, before our wedding in Miami, she had signed a prenuptial agreement without much argument. At the time she had laughed and said it was just a formality, that of course we would never need it. The agreement had been thorough, drafted carefully, and it included an infidelity clause that was very clear about consequences. I remember feeling slightly uncomfortable insisting on it back then, but tonight I felt nothing but gratitude for my past caution. She wouldn't get the house. The house I had paid for, renovated, maintained. She wouldn't get access to my investment accounts or the savings I had built long before she walked down the aisle. She wouldn't receive spousal support. The terms were straightforward and legally binding. Around us, the room was still full of people who had come expecting a celebration and were now witnessing the dismantling of 2 marriages at once. I could feel their eyes moving between us, the silence heavy and suffocating. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered finally, her voice small and stripped of the confidence she had worn all evening. I looked at her for a long second. This was the woman I had promised forever to, the woman I had trusted without hesitation, the woman who had tried to convince me to raise another man's child while smiling in my face. I shrugged, not out of cruelty, but out of detachment. "Ask Ethan," I said. He was still standing off to the side, clutching his own envelope, his carefully constructed life collapsing just as visibly as mine had moments earlier. For once, I wasn't the one blindsided. I turned away from Megan without another word. I thanked everyone for coming, my voice steady, almost polite, as if I were ending a dinner party instead of a marriage. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside into the cool night air. The noise inside the house swelled briefly behind me before the door shut, cutting it off completely. As I crossed the driveway toward my truck, I glanced back once at the house. The lights were still on, shadows moving behind the curtains, fragments of a life that no longer belonged to me. It was the house she thought she would secure through deception, the stability she believed she could anchor herself to while rewriting the truth. I got into the driver's seat, closed the door, and for a moment just sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel. My chest didn't feel tight anymore. My thoughts weren't racing. When I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, I realized what the quiet inside me actually was. Relief. For months I had lived with confusion, self-doubt, and the slow erosion of intimacy I couldn't explain. Tonight there was no confusion left. She had tried to trap me with a lie, to bind me to a future built on betrayal. Instead, she had trapped herself.